Hello. Welcome to our last web seminar of the year, Choosing the Best Feeds for Preterm Infants, the Evidence from Cochrane Systematic Reviews. I'm Roger Soll, the coordinating editor of Cochrane Neonatal, and on behalf of our editorial team, including Bill McGuire from the Hull York Medical School, and Colleen Ovalman and Caitlin O'Connell-Eckert, our managing editor and assistant managing editor here in Burlington, we welcome you. I'd like to acknowledge the support of our senior editorial team, Michael Bracken, Jeffrey Horbar, Prakash Shah, and Gautam Suresh, as well as our newly appointed senior editors, Jackie Ho, Lisa Askey, and David Osborne, as well as our associate editors who provide the muscle behind Cochrane Neonatal. For today's seminar, I'm also very happy to welcome our guest discussants, Heather Kaplan and Brenda Poindexter, both of the University of Cincinnati, and both are experts on the issue of feeding the preterm infant. I'd like to acknowledge support here at Vermont Oxford Network, as well as from the Academy of Pediatrics, and acknowledge the support from the Gerber Foundation, from whom we've received an unrestricted grant to support the updating of these reviews on feeding preterm infants. As a matter of disclosure, I am the president of Vermont Oxford Network and the coordinating editor of Cochrane Neonatal, but have no other relevant financial issues to disclose. The mission of these seminars has been to develop an understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of evidence provided by systematic reviews and meta-analyses that inform our practice of neonatal perinatal medicine, and in this case, in specific reference to what we feed preterm infants. Clearly, we believe that systematic reviews, meta-analyses, and randomized controlled trials represent the best evidence to inform my practice. However, when we look at the issue of feeding, I think we do need to begin with other sources of evidence and look to experts to help guide us about the rationale for the feeding of the preterm infants. And I would strongly recommend taking a look at this review article from William Hay in Neonatology in 2008, which outlines the need and rationale for the issues regarding preterm infant nutrition. As smaller and smaller preterm babies survive, we've been called on to develop more effective nutritional strategies, including how to optimize breastfeeding, how to develop newer formulas, what to supplement enteral feeds with, and whether or not parenteral feeding solutions are an important adjunct to our nutritional strategies. I think that most neonatologists have accepted the recommendation of the American Academy of Pediatrics that growth of the postnatal preterm infant, both their anthropometric indices and body composition, should be the same as the normal fetus of the same gestational age growing in its mother's uterus. But in reality, this proves to be a challenge. Reports from NICUs around the world demonstrate that we have considerable room for improvement. The growth of nearly all preterm infants during their hospitalization in intensive care, especially those of the earliest gestational ages, lag far behind fetal growth curves in the third trimester. Looking at data from Vermont Oxford Network, we see that 31% of very low birth weight infants have extreme growth failure, defined as being less than the third percentile on the Fenton growth chart at discharge. This growth failure varies greatly between units, with some units, a quarter of the units, having 20% of their babies or fewer having extreme growth failure, but other units, a quarter of the other units, have 40% of their very low birth weight infants or more having extreme growth failure. And this variation makes us think that there is really room for improvement in our practices. Hay notes that this pattern of growth failure was observed over 60 years ago, indicating that despite major advances in neonatal medicine, strategies to provide adequate nutrition to preterm infants and achieve better rates of growth have not kept pace with other improvements in neonatal care and neonatal survival. We see a great deal in variation in feeding practices. For example, the successful use of human milk, such as that infants are receiving any human milk at the time of discharge home, occurs in an average of 57% of discharged very low birth weight infants, with great variation between centers, with the first quartile being 44.4% or fewer, and the third quartile being 73% or more. What is the underlying cause of growth failure in preterm infants? Well, in Hayes' review, he notes that the main answer is obvious. We have not fed infants enough protein and enough energy to meet the requirements for fetal growth. More aggressive parenteral and enteral feeding practices can ameliorate but not completely address these deficiencies. What are the downstream effects of undernutrition and growth failure? Numerous studies have shown that failure to meet the preterm infant's nutritional goals at critical stages of development produce serious problems for the preterm infant, including short stature, growth failure, and abnormalities of brain growth and development. The aggressive use of parenteral nutrition has ameliorated some of the gross nutritional deficiencies experienced by preterm infants, but cannot meet all goals and is associated with many adverse consequences. The lack of enteral feeding leads to mucosal and villus atrophy and reduction of the enzymes necessary for digestion, substrate absorption, and growth. These underlying conditions contribute to serious diseases such as necrotizing enterocolitis. We have identified 3 key areas or gaps in preterm infant nutrition knowledge: the types of feeding, how you can optimize the nutritional content of feeds, and feeding strategies and feeding methods. And for this seminar, we're going to focus on the first, the types of feeds, and ask, what do we know from clinical trials regarding what to feed preterm infants? Well, there are at least 6 systematic reviews in the Cochrane Neonatal Review Group that address these issues. There's formula versus maternal breast milk for feeding preterm or low birth weight infants. Formula versus donor breast milk for feeding preterm or low birth weight infants. Banked preterm versus banked term human milk to promote growth and development in very low birth weight infants. Nutrient-enriched or preterm formulas versus standard formulas for preterm infants. Dilute versus full-strength formula in exclusively formula-fed preterm or low birth weight infants, and the use of protein hydrolysate versus standard formula for preterm infants. So we'll take a look at these 6 reviews, and we'll start with the one that has the most interest to the neonatal community: formula versus maternal breast milk for feeding preterm or low birth weight infants. And let's spend a little time with the rationale for this review. First, the substrate, the type of feeding, matters greatly, and breast milk clearly is the optimal enteral feed. Maternal breast milk is recommended by most guidelines and most academies of pediatrics. Why might maternal breast milk be best? In addition to the macro and micronutrients that are optimized by evolution for digestion and absorption by human infants, maternal breast milk contains numerous immunonutrients, such as secretory immunoglobulin A, lactoferrin, cytokines, enzymes, growth factors, and leukocytes. An important benefit of maternal breast milk for preterm or low birth weight infants is that delivery of these immunological and growth factors to the immature intestinal mucosa promotes postnatal physiological, neuroendocrinological, and metabolic adaptation. Evidence from observational studies suggests that feeding with maternal breast milk rather than formula is associated with a reduced risk of serious adverse outcomes, including necrotizing enterocolitis and infection. Why might maternal breast milk not be the best feed for preterm infants? The nutritional requirements of preterm infants may not be met by enteral feeding with maternal breast milk alone. Maternal breast milk varies in energy and protein content depending upon the stage of lactation at which it is collected, the duration of lactation, and the method of storage and delivery. Many of the processes involved in handling maternal breast milk, including refrigeration, freeze-thawing, and pasteurization, can reduce its macronutrient and immunonutrient content. Supplementation of maternal breast milk with nutrient fortifiers, which are typically extracted from cow's milk, is an option for increasing nutrient density. Although this results in faster short-term growth, uncertainty remains about whether fortification using bovine milk extracts increases the risk of enteral feed intolerance or necrotizing enterocolitis in very preterm or very low birth weight infants. We'll discuss some of these issues of supplementation in future Cochrane seminars. We've talked about breast milk, but what do we mean when we say formula? As an alternative to breast milk, there are a variety of artificial formulas, usually modified from cow's milk, for feeding preterm or low birth weight infants that are commercially available. These formulas vary in energy, protein, and micronutrient content, and broadly can be categorized as standard term formulas, formulas designed for term infants based on the composition of mature breast milk, with a typical energy content between 67 and 70 kilocalories per 100 ml, or nutrient-enriched preterm formulas designed for preterm infants to provide nutrient intakes to match intrauterine accretion rates. These are energy-enriched, typically up to 80 kilocalories per 100 ml, and are variably protein and mineral enriched. What are the pros and cons of preterm formula? Artificial formula, particularly nutrient-enriched preterm formula, might provide consistently higher levels of nutrients than maternal breast milk does. However, artificial formulas do not contain the same immunonutritional factors that are present in maternal breast milk. Furthermore, although bovine proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids in artificial formulas are modified to improve digestibility for newborn infants, these are less likely to be tolerated than human milk macronutrients, especially by the immature preterm intestine. Formula feeding might therefore delay the functional adaptation of the gastrointestinal tract and disrupt the pattern of microbial colonization. But the disappointing truth is that there are no eligible studies that compare formula versus maternal breast milk, and this really comes as no surprise. Such trials are unlikely to be conducted because of the difficulty of allocating an alternative form of nutrition to an infant whose mother wishes to feed with her own breast milk. Maternal breast milk remains the default choice of enteral nutrition because of the data we have from observational studies and meta-analyses comparing feeding with formula versus donor breast milk, suggesting that feeding with breast milk has major immunonutritional advantages for preterm and low birth weight infants. So let's take a look at those reviews that indirectly support the feeding of breast milk. And here we have Quigley's review of formula versus donor breast milk for feeding preterm or low birth weight infants. Clearly, maternal breast milk is the recommended source of nutrition for preterm infants. But the question of what to do when sufficient maternal breast milk is not available has been frequently one that we confront in the NICU. There are two common alternatives available for feeding preterm or low birth weight infants, either artificial formula or donor breast milk. These may be given either as a sole form of enteral nutrition or as a supplement to maternal breast milk. We talked a little bit already about artificial formulas, mostly adapted from cow's milk, and either the standard term formulas or the nutrient-enriched preterm formulas. But let's take a few minutes to discuss donor breast milk. Expressed breast milk from donor mothers, usually mothers who have delivered at term, generally has a lower content of energy and protein than term formula milk. The macronutrient content of donor breast milk is not compromised substantially by modern pasteurization methods, but levels of aminoactive components might be reduced. Donor human milk also varies regarding fat, energy, and protein content, depending on the stage of lactation at which the milk is collected. The nutritional requirements of preterm or low birth weight infants may not be fully met by enteral feeds with donor breast milk. These deficiencies may have adverse consequences for growth and development. However, a major potential advantage of donor breast milk is that the delivery of immunoprotective and growth factors to the immature gut mucosa may prevent serious adverse outcomes, including necrotizing enterocolitis and invasive infection. For this meta-analysis, the authors identified 12 trials with a total of 1,879 infants that fulfilled the inclusion criteria. 4 trials compared standard term formula versus donor breast milk, and 8 compared nutrient-enriched preterm formula versus donor breast milk. Only the 5 most recent trials used nutrient-fortified donor breast milk. The trials contained various weaknesses regarding methodological quality, specifically concerns about allocation concealment in 4 trials and lack of blinding in most of the trials. In addition, most of the included trials were funded by the companies that made the study formula. So here we look at the meta-analysis regarding weight gain, and we see the 3 subgroups of term formula versus unfortified donor breast milk, preterm formula versus unfortified donor breast milk, and preterm formula versus fortified donor breast milk. And in each of these groups, we see better weight gain in the formula-fed infants. Overall, we see that formula-fed infants had a higher in-hospital rate of weight gain, with a mean difference of 2.51 grams per kilo per day and a 95% confidence interval from 1.93 to 3.08 grams per kilo per day. Similarly, we see improvements regarding head growth. Overall, infants either fed term formula versus unfortified donor breast milk or preterm formula versus unfortified donor breast milk showed better head growth in the formula-fed infants. And overall, formula-fed infants had higher in-hospital rates of head growth with a mean difference of 0.85 millimeters per week and a 95% confidence interval of 0.47 to 1.23 millimeters per week. Importantly, regarding clinical outcomes, there is a suggestion that there is an increased risk of necrotizing enterocolitis associated with formula feeding. Overall, formula-fed infants had a higher risk of NEC with a typical risk ratio of 1.87 and a 95% confidence interval of 1.23 to 2.85. The risk difference is 3% with a confidence interval of 1% to 5%. Therefore, the number needed to treat for an additional harmful effect of feeding formula is 33 infants with a 95% confidence interval of 20 to 100 infants. When we look at a subgroup analysis that compared formula versus donor breast milk, either given as a sole diet or as a supplement to maternal express breast milk, we see similar issues. We see better weight gain associated with formula feeding, whether it's a sole diet or a supplement to maternal breast milk. But we also see some concern regarding necrotizing enterocolitis, particularly when comparing a sole diet of donor breast milk to formula milk. The authors conclude that in preterm and low birth weight infants, there is moderate certainty evidence indicating that feeding with formula compared to donor breast milk, either as a supplement to maternal expressed breast milk or as a sole diet, results in a higher rate of weight gain, linear growth, and head growth, but also a higher risk of developing necrotizing enterocolitis. The trial data do not show an effect on all-cause mortality or on long-term growth or neurodevelopment. So we also have reviews that have attempted to look at the differences between banked preterm versus banked term human milk. The idea of feeding another mother's milk to your baby is centuries and centuries old. However, only in the last 3 decades has human milk banking played an important role in modern neonatal intensive care. The milk provided by milk banking is predominantly term breast milk, often produced later in lactation, so it has a different nutritional content. Although many breast milk banking services now also batch and provide donated preterm breast milk. 67% of people responding to our survey prior to the seminar noted that they have donor breast milk banking services available at their hospital. The nutritional and non-nutritional components of human milk differ as gestational age advances. The relative constituents of protein, fat, and carbohydrate differ, as do the non-nutritional components, including variations in digestive hormones, growth factors, immunologic factors, vitamins, minerals, and trace elements. For this review, the authors sought to determine the effect of banked donor preterm milk compared to banked donor term milk. However, they found no studies that met their inclusion criteria, and therefore found no evidence to support or refute the effect of banked donor preterm milk compared to banked term milk regarding growth and development in very low birth weight infants. So let's move on now to the systematic reviews of nutrient-enriched preterm formula versus standard term formula for feeding preterm infants. Preterm infants, especially the very preterm infant, have fewer nutrient reserves at birth than term infants and are subject to physiological and metabolic stresses that increase their nutrient needs. Most very preterm infants accumulate substantial energy, protein, mineral, and other nutrient deficits during their initial hospital stay. By the time these infants are ready to go home, typically around 36 to 40 weeks postmenstrual age, many of these infants are growth restricted relative to their term-born peers. Growth deficits, which can persist throughout childhood and adolescence, are associated with neurodevelopmental impairment, poor cognitive and educational outcomes. When sufficient human breast milk is not available, an artificial formula given as a sole form of enteral nutrition or as a supplement to human breast milk may be used as an alternative. A variety of formulas, as we've noted, are available. Most are adapted from cow's milk and vary in energy, protein, and mineral content. As noted, they can be categorized as standard term formulas or nutrient-enriched preterm formulas, and they not only differ in caloric density, but also in the concentrations of protein, concentrations of calcium and phosphorus, and other minerals and vitamins. The authors identified 7 trials, but with relatively few infants, 590 preterm infants. Most of the participants were clinically stable preterm infants with birth weights less than 1,850 grams. Few participants in these trials were extremely preterm, extremely low birth weight, or growth restricted at birth. And the trials were conducted some time ago, 30 years ago, were formula industry funded, and were small with methodologic weaknesses, including a lack of blinding that might bias the estimates of effect. In addition, our ability to summarize these outcomes was limited by the use of different in-hospital growth parameters. Looking at the evidence, we find that there is low certainty evidence that suggests that feeding with nutrient-enriched formula increases in-hospital rates of weight gain. In addition, there is low certainty evidence that suggests that feeding with nutrient-enriched formulas increases in-hospital rates of head circumference growth. There is no evidence of an increased risk of necrotizing enterocolitis associated with either feeding nutrient-enriched formula or standard formula, with a relative risk of 0.72 and a 95% confidence interval of 0.41 to 1.25. However, it should be noted that this is only in 3 studies with 489 infants. Fewer data are available for growth and developmental outcomes assessed beyond infancy, and those that are available do not show consistent effects of nutrient-enriched formula feeding. Data from 2 trials did not show an effect on Bayley Mental Development Index at 18 months post-term. Infants who received nutrient-enriched formula had higher Bayley Psychomotor Development Index scores at 18 months post-term, but there's no evidence to suggest an effect on cerebral palsy, with a typical relative risk of 0.79 and 95% confidence interval ranging from 0.30 to 2.07. Again, this is on limited data from only 2 studies and 377 infants. The authors conclude that available trial data show that feeding preterm infants nutrient-enriched compared with standard formulas has only modest effects on growth rates during their initial hospital admission, and there is no evidence that suggests that long-term growth or development is affected by these choices. The grade assessment indicates that the certainty of this evidence is low, and that these findings should be incorporated and applied with some caution, and that further randomized controlled trials, given how few a number of infants have been studied, would help resolve this uncertainty. There are other feeding practices that are worth taking a look at in this session, and here we'll look at the issue of dilute versus full-strength formula in exclusively formula-fed preterm or low birth weight infants. There is a rationale to consider whether or not dilute feedings might provide a benefit to preterm infants. Milk osmolarity has been suggested as a risk factor for developing feeding intolerance and necrotizing enterocolitis, either through damaging the bowel mucosa or by influencing the development or growth of the gut. However, the evidence to support either mechanism is limited. The osmolality of breast milk from mothers at term is around 300 milliosmoles per kilo, and from mothers of preterm around 276 milliosmoles per kilo. Preterm infant formulas frequently exceed this osmolarity. The addition of fortifiers will further increase the osmolality of milk, and dilution of formula may be one way to reduce osmolality and therefore decrease feeding intolerance and necrotizing enterocolitis. The authors identified 3 studies involving 102 preterm infants or low birth weight infants. The studies compared dilute, double volume, half-strength formula with full-strength formula. All 3 studies were assessed as having unclear risk of bias due to the likely absence of blinding of study personnel and the potential for selection bias in the largest of the trials. And data for the primary outcome of necrotizing enterocolitis was not reported in any of these studies. The authors were only able to combine 2 of the studies involving only 88 infants in this analysis, and the evidence suggests that dilute formula with double volume, half strength, may lead to fewer episodes of gastric residuals per day, fewer episodes of gastric residuals per baby until attaining 100 kilocalories per kilo, fewer episodes of vomiting per day, and fewer occurrences of abdominal distension greater than 2 centimeters. For the secondary outcomes, data suggest that infants in the dilute formula with double volume, half-strength group may have attained an adequate energy intake earlier than infants in the full-strength group. There was no evidence of a difference between the groups for weight gain 1 week after commencement of intragastric feeds, and data were not reported on hospital length of stay. The authors conclude that there is low certainty evidence from 3 small, old trials that use dilute formula in preterm or low birth weight infant formula fed infants may lead to an important reduction in the time taken for preterm infants to attain adequate energy intake. However, our confidence in this result is limited due to uncertainty over risk of bias and the sparsity of available data. Dilute formula may reduce the incidence of feeding intolerance, but the clinical significance of this reduction remains uncertain, particularly given that the impact on serious gastrointestinal problems, including necrotizing enterocolitis, was not reported in any of these trials, and that further randomized trials are needed to confirm these results based on such old and rare data. So let's end up talking about one other issue regarding substrate, and that is the feeding of protein hydrolysate compared to standard formula for preterm infants. Hydrolyzed cow's milk formulas were originally developed for infants with cow's milk protein allergy or intolerance, have become used in enteral feeding alternatives for preterm infants in whom human milk is unavailable. These formulas contain hydrolyzed rather than intact proteins and may differ from standard cow's milk formulas in carbohydrate, lipid, and micronutrient type and content. Their use as a sole or supplemental enteral feed source for preterm infants has increased since the late 1990s, particularly in high-income countries, because they're perceived as being tolerated better and less likely to lead to complications than standard cow's milk formulas. However, hydrolyzed formulas are more expensive than standard formulas, and concern exists that their practice is not supported by high certainty evidence. The authors identified a fair number of studies, 11 studies for inclusion in the review, but the trials were small, having a total participant of 665 and had various methodological limitations, including uncertainty about methods to ensure allocation concealment and blinding. Most participants were clinically stable preterm infants of less than about 34 weeks gestational age, or with birth weight less than about 1,750 grams. Fewer participants were extremely preterm, extremely low birth weight, or growth restricted. Most trials found no effect on feed intolerance, assessed variously as mean pre-feed gastric residual volume, incidence of abdominal distension, or other gastrointestinal signs of concern, or time taken to achieve full enteral feeds. Looking at necrotizing enterocolitis, the meta-analysis showed no effect overall on the risk of necrotizing enterocolitis, with a typical risk ratio of 1.10 and a broad 95% confidence interval from 0.36 to 3.34. The risk difference was literally zero, with a 95% confidence interval that could be compatible with 3% less NEC or 4% more NEC. This evidence was considered of low certainty and was downgraded because of imprecision and design study weakness. Weight gain was less in the few studies that reported on weight gain for infants receiving hydrolyzed formula versus non-hydrolyzed formula. The authors conclude that the identified trials provide only low certainty evidence about the effects of feeding preterm infants hydrolysate versus standard formula, and that existing data do not support conclusions that feeding protein hydrolysate affects the risk of feed intolerance or necrotizing enterocolitis. They suggest that additional large pragmatic trials are needed to provide more reliable and precise estimates of the effectiveness and cost effectiveness of this intervention. So at this point in time, I'd like to bring in our guest discussants, Heather Kaplan and Brenda Poindexter from the University of Cincinnati, to add their insights as well as to field some of the questions that you chat in. Thank you. So welcome. We're now to our live part of our session, and we have on the line both Heather Kaplan and Brenda Poindexter from the University of Cincinnati. And I'm pleased that we're also joined by Bill McGuire, our co-coordinating editor, who is the author of many of the reviews that I previously reviewed. Just to warm things up, I thought I would at least remind us of some of the survey issues that we sent out previously, and just recognize that there are many surveys about enteral feeding practices. We based ours greatly on the Klingenberg survey, but there are other surveys as well of practice in Canada as well as practice in the US, and they all demonstrate great variation in feeding practices. Specifically, I was somewhat surprised to see that only about 2/3 of the units claimed that they had access to donor human milk. And clearly the vast majority of these units had an external milk bank that they were relying on. This issue of access to preterm donor milk was stated to be in 50% or so, and I think our experts question a little bit whether or not we know what we're talking about when we answer that. I'll also, just to finish up some of the survey issues before I turn things over to our guest discussants, asked about this issue of dilute formula, which has some promise when we look at the trials, but in fact is a practice that the vast majority of us do not use. And in a little over a quarter of the centers, there are policies and guidelines regarding the use of hydrolyzed formula, which again, the evidence basis is uncertain. So I'd like to turn things over first to Heather and Brenda for their comments, and then encourage you to chat in your comments and questions, and we'll try to get to them all. We've got plenty of time. So Heather, Brenda, let's put you on and hear first your comments, and then I'll try to feed you some of the questions from our audience.
Yeah, thanks, Roger. This is Brenda. I think that the review was really helpful and raises a lot of points, for practice. I think it's complicated by many of the studies that have gone into the reviews being, fairly older studies before we had the availability of some of the products that we have at our disposal now. And I think many were also, conducted in an era when babies stayed on parental nutrition much longer, and the focus really wasn't as much on early enteral nutrition. But I think, it certainly, raises a lot of things for discussion. I guess in my mind, one of the questions is how do we further the evidence? And, are some of these issues related to how we provide optimal nutrition in the neonatal intensive care unit? I mean, are they really things that we need to be doing randomized trials for? And if so, what kind of outcomes do we pick? You alluded to some of the longer term outcomes that are harder and more costly to assess, but I think we would argue are critically important. And, not to mention the confounding by all of the other things that happen to babies in the newborn ICU.
Thanks, Brenda.
So,
Please, Heather.
My comment. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, I was just going to comment. I think, I think there's always a step that occurs after we have kind of a great synthesis of evidence like this that's presented by Cochrane, where we stop and pause and we think about this evidence in the context of our own units. And so I think, the next step for everyone who's kind of listening and processing some of this evidence that you presented, Roger, is to really understand what's happening in our own units. And I think those surveys are pretty enlightening that you showed at the end. And I think even in our own practice, right, we might think we know what we're doing, but until we actually look and measure, I may or may not be doing the same thing as what my partner is doing when he or she practices the next day or the next week. So to really look at our practices, and then if there are changes we want to make based on this evidence, if we are, swayed by the physiologic rationale regarding breast milk feeding being the best substrate for feeding for infants, regardless of the lack of data that's there. But if we're persuaded by that, and we're at that 57% median of centers discharging babies home on breast milk, how do we actually make changes to increase mom's ability to provide milk in her own practice? Or if we have concerns about growth, how do we stop and think about how do we optimize growth in our units? How are we even measuring growth in our units? Or how standardized are we in how we measure weight, particularly the length? How many of us are using length boards versus tape measures? So I think, the step beyond what you presented today, Roger, really is what's going on in our unit, and when we want to take some of what you presented today and actually apply it, how do we do that in a systematic and more rigorous way?
I began with the comment about the AAP recommendations about somehow how postnatal growth should mimic intrauterine growth. And I've heard people, Nina Modi for one, speak quite eloquently on the fact that is that really a responsible and reasonable goal? It teleologically makes sense. That's what we think happened in nature, but there's nothing natural about it. Do you have any thoughts about what our goals should be and what the right measures in terms of managing these babies' growth should be?
Yeah, I wish that I did. I mean, physiologically, it makes sense to me that, the ideal environment would have been for the baby to stay in utero, but clearly, that's not what the situation that we have. And because I think most of us don't really come close to matching the intrauterine growth, we say, well, maybe that's not the right goal. But, again, I think figuring out what really are the outcomes that are most important to us and most important to families. And I think, the difference between looking at in-hospital growth outcomes to maybe, 2 to 3 year neurodevelopment, and then looking at later adult onset diseases, those, you might get different answers depending on which outcome you deem to be most important.
So looking at the chat, we predictably got lots of questions that are going to relate to a future web seminar, namely what fortification we should use. I'm going to hold those back for now, though I recognize that that's clearly the most pressing question, and I don't mean to put the audience off by saying, come back in 11 months and hear from us on it. But I will focus on some of the questions first that related to what we discussed this afternoon. The first was any comments about the fact that dilute formula is not commonly used. And a follow-up question to that is, if it is used, is there any sense about how it should be sort of concentrated or undiluted over time? So I guess general thoughts about the use of dilute formula for an introduction and whether or not that's a practice that requires more thought.
Heather and I were talking, Roger, as you were going through the slides, saying that I think when we were both residents there, we worked in units where at one time that was the practice. It is not something that I have done, I think, for almost 15 years. And, I think when you look at those macronutrient requirements of the preterm infant, if you are diluting, formula or human milk, there is no way you're going to come close to meeting those targets for intake. And so, I think in the absence of any, compelling evidence that using full strength is going to be harmful, just simply based on, the macronutrient content, I don't think that using diluted formula is a practice that can be condoned at the present time.
It's interesting how, you look at the evidence sort of, a step away, and it looks appealing, and that the nutrient issues, because they were able to advance feeds more rapidly, perhaps were met. I don't know enough about the core studies, and I think that they're relatively old. How would that fit in with our ideas about trophic feeding now? Again, not a discussion for this seminar, but it's hard to interpret some of these practices with the changes of our fundamental approach. So I take your point, Brenda. I'm not sure what to make of that data. I don't necessarily think it's a pearl waiting to be picked up by people given modern practice, but it's an interesting point, especially if it was combined with other things that have evolved as appropriate feeding strategies.
And I think some of that fear has trickled over into some of our current practices with some units, I think, sort of extrapolating that to delayed fortification, particularly of donor milk. And, I think, again, it's that trade-off between if you really think increased osmolality is a risk of NEC, versus suboptimal growth being a significant risk for impaired neurodevelopment. And, I think that you have to really consider both hand in hand.
One of the issues that I hope that I covered in terms of the reviews is obviously the paucity of data specifically about feeding mother's own milk, but whether or not the issue whether the donor milk review does stand as a surrogate for even sort of a near match to mother's milk. And if in fact you do endorse the use of donor milk, what's the population you think would most benefit from this? So I guess question one, your feeling about the evidence supporting the use of donor milk, and if you support it, how would you think about standardizing it in your unit, or how do you standardize it?
So I'll answer the first part, and then I'll let Heather tackle the second one. I think there is no question that maternal milk and donor milk, have shown to be associated with a lower incidence of NEC. And so for me, the practice of choosing to implement donor human milk is really based on the ability to decrease NEC. I think that the Canadian Domino trial and led to more information about the impact of donor milk on neurodevelopmental outcomes. The NICHD NRN donor milk trial was recently, enrollment has recently been halted, and we're awaiting the 2-year outcome there. So, I think that there's more data that will be coming out in the next few years that should really give us, more information about the impact on longer-term outcomes. But in my mind, I think the biggest push and rationale for using donor milk is as part of a plan to reduce NEC.
And then to the question about standardization, at least here in Cincinnati, we standardized our feeding practices across our level 3 NICUs and are using donor milk in babies less than 1,500 grams. And I think a lot of the way that we approach this here is to kind of balance or look at the evidence from the literature and the actual protocols that were used in the study and try and mimic those, but adapt it to our local context. So, and balancing resource constraint issues and kind of the incidence of NEC in our population and those who are at greatest risk. So we, again, use it in babies less than 1,500 grams, and we use it for the first 4 weeks, which I know is actually a little bit less than what some other folks do. Some folks extend it out to closer to the time of discharge. And here we do it for kind of 28 days. And again, that was balancing how it was done in the original studies or the studies that are out there based on and then adapted to our own context and what seemed to make sense for us based on our population, where we were seeing NEC and our incidence and what makes sense from us practically from a resource perspective.
Great, thank you.
And I think the thing I would add to that is our standardized feeding protocol is the same for all babies less than 1,500 grams. And so I think one thing for units to consider is whether that is appropriate for all babies of a certain weight or gestation, or if, for instance, would you have a different approach with the 500-gram baby versus the one that's $14.99. And equally, is your approach, especially to fortification, the same if the predominant base diet is donor milk versus maternal milk? And as you pointed out, we know that there are differences in the macronutrient content. And so, if we're predominantly using donor milk, should the guideline be different if for that baby than for one of the same weight and gestation who is receiving predominantly mother's own preterm milk?
And I should say too, our standardized feeding approach really emphasizes the feeding over the first 2 weeks of life, and then beyond that, there's a lot of customization that needs to happen, as Brenda kind of alluded to, related to what the primary substrate is, if we're using donor milk as a bridge to mom's own milk, and mom's getting milk now versus she's not, and it's really an all donor milk based diet, the size of the infant and how their growth is looking after they get up to feed. So I would say, although, that we believe in standardization, we think standardization is important, but that's balanced with the customization that's needed for each individual infant. And so our approach to that has been the standardized over that first getting to full volume feeds, and then there is quite a bit of customization that happens depending on the individual infant's needs.
So a couple of more just follow-up questions on this donor milk issue that have been chatted in. One actually, it wasn't chatted in, it's my question. The authors of the preterm donor versus term donor review are European. And I assumed that my lack of familiarity with preterm donor breast milk was because I'm not European. But in our survey, we had 50% of people say that they had access to preterm donor breast milk. That said, if I was asked to fill out the survey, I'm not sure I would know what to say. I'm curious about your take. Is this a available product specifically for our North American colleagues who are online? Is it something that you're familiar with? And is our survey correct?
Roger, I'm honestly not sure. We get our donor milk from the Ohio Mother's Milk Bank, and I am not aware that we can specify whether we want term or preterm milk. People have looked at, again, the macronutrient content on the label that comes from some of the milk banks and, have found, rather alarming differences, again, in what, is measured at one site versus what actually ends up being fed to the baby. I would think that the number of moms who deliver a premature baby who have an abundance of milk supply to be able to donate to a milk bank, I guess I'm going to maintain some skepticism about, how large of a resource that really is. And if there are participants, on this call who are aware of those resources, I would love to hear about it because it's just not something that I have a lot of familiarity with either.
Nor I. Another quick question on donor milk before we move on is the issue of pasteurization. Steve Gelfin writes in about, should we care? Holder versus, other methods. Does it matter? Should we care? Should we know about this?
I think each milk bank is going to have their standardized process. I'm not sure that there are huge differences in the methods. I think it is important that we be aware of which bioactive components of milk are impacted by pasteurization. One of the things that I think we don't spend enough time thinking about is the processing that occurs after pasteurization. And so the number of times that the milk is handled, that it goes into different containers, how it gets from even your own milk or formula room in the hospital to the baby, and whether you're giving it by bolus or continuous. Every time the milk is transferred or comes into contact with additional containers, you have the potential to lose some of the fat content. And so, I think clearly in using donor milk, it has to be pasteurized. And so it's not that I don't think we should worry about it, but, I think that even pasteurized, the benefits for reducing NEC are clear enough that, I think that's what we should be using. But hopefully, as people are implementing donor milk programs, they are making sure that then isn't a reason to decrease mother's own milk provision, and that, there would be sort of simultaneous efforts to increase the percentage of moms that are expressing and providing milk for their babies in the NICU.
Great. So as our time is running out, and there are lots of questions on the chat, and I so appreciate that, we will try to tap our experts to answer a few of them offline and put it on the listserv. But I do want to add, because I'm very pleased to see Dr. Fenton writing in, who has a more positive view about growth than I presented, and given the real expertise that lies there, I'd like to just read the comments, if I can, without my glasses. Dr. Fenton says, I believe that we actually do often achieve intrauterine growth rates, and the problem is with the current definition of growth failure and growth restriction. Using the 10th percentile at discharge is not appropriate after the routine postnatal weight loss. Even infants who grow at intrauterine growth rates are likely to have their weight below the 10th percentile at discharge. And I would just note that although, of course, I'm pleased with a more positive view of things, the data I presented was 3rd percentile. And I don't think that there'd be any dispute that we want to achieve better than that. But your thoughts about whether or not we're actually doing better than I advertised?
Well, I think it all hinges on the definition, and so, I think we have made some improvements, but I really think focusing not only on the weight but also on linear growth is something that is receiving more and more attention, and the association between linear growth and other longer-term outcomes such as neurodevelopment, I think is becoming much clearer. And so, one of the things that I think really should be considered standard is having, true link board measurements in our tiniest babies. And, that's not an easy thing to do, but I think really focusing not only on weight, but also on length and head circumference growth is something, for units to really pay close attention to.
And I would also comment, I think even if we can quibble about the definition and look at the less than 3%, I think the variation that's still present, right, it illuminates opportunities for improvement. So even if some centers are doing a pretty good job, and obviously it's not risk-adjusted data, it doesn't look at your percent SGA at birth, all that kind of stuff. But I think obviously, as in all outcomes and processes in neonatology, there's still a lot of variation, which does beg the suggestion that there's ways that we could be doing this better, both as new evidence emerges and we learn more about like some of these folks, the questions that folks are asking, where we don't have evidence, and Brenda alluded to this at the beginning, where we need to generate more evidence. But then even as we think about the way that we apply the evidence that we have.
Oh, fantastic. I'm afraid our time is running out. Some people did ask about what we should be measuring for growth and how we should be measuring. Hopefully we'll get to some of these questions on the listserv and get them out to everyone. Lots of fantastic chat. I thank you. I want to stop and thank our two experts, Heather and Brenda. I'd like to thank Bill McGuire for being in the background in case I desperately needed him. And I'll turn things over to Colleen just to talk a little bit about CME and our next planned seminars.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And finally, I want to let you know that we will be continuing in 2020 with our evidence-based medicine basics and beyond series. Session 5 will be about grade recommendations and will be on March 23rd. And there'll be another session coming up in June. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We enjoy having you here, and we appreciate your continued support of Cochrane Neonatal.